Welcome back to the deep dive. All right, so today we're going to jump head first into what might be a turning point for Bitcoin. We've got a rare buy signal on our radar.
Oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, we're taking a look at some insights from a recent market open stream that not only highlighted this signal, but also break down some of the broader market movements we've been seeing.
Sure.
And, of course, there's always a ton of upcoming economic events that could move the needle.
Right.
But really, our aim here, our mission for you today, is to really distill the meaning of this buy signal, especially within the current economic backdrop and the, always dynamic crypto market. We want to give you a clear picture of what might be coming next.
Yeah.
And we want to do that without overwhelming you with, all the technical jargon.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great goal.
So let's unpack this rare signal, shall we?
Okay, yeah. So what I find really interesting about this this rare buy signal for Bitcoin, like it's not just about some, quick price movement. It's actually based on something called hash ribbons.
Okay, hash ribbons.
I know hash ribbons track how profitable Bitcoin mining is. And what's really insightful here for you is that it reflects a change in how miners are behaving.
Right.
When you see this signal, it often means miners have been forced to sell off a lot of their Bitcoin.
Oh, I see.
And that usually marks the point where the weaker hands in the market, the ones who are maybe less confident, they kind of give up.
Oh, so like a capitulation kind of thing.
Exactly, capitulation. And that suggests the miners who are left, they're the more resilient ones.
Okay.
The ones who are more optimistic about the long term.
Interesting.
And this can create a sort of vacuum in the selling pressure, which then allows demand to more easily push the price upwards.
So it's like the bedrock of the network, the miners themselves, they're potentially reducing how much Bitcoin they're selling.
Precisely.
And the source did mention that this signal usually tops up after we've seen some pretty big price drops, like corrections of 30 to 40%,
Right.
or even after, major downturns in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So it's suggesting we might be at the tail end of that intense selling period.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, we're moving into a phase where Bitcoin starts getting accumulated again.
Exactly. And, this isn't something you see every day.
Yeah.
The source pointed out that the last couple of times the signal flashed were around June or July in each of the past 2 years.
Okay.
So it's pretty rare.
Right. And that rarity is what makes it, potentially a very strong indicator.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about what happened historically after those June or July signals. The source touched on this, and it's pretty fascinating, actually. What followed those signals?
Well, if we look at the bigger picture, the source suggests that those past instances, the ones in June or July, they were indeed followed by some pretty significant price increases for Bitcoin. And those increases happened within the months that followed.
Wow. Okay. So that's definitely a pattern that gets your attention.
Right.
The source even went so far as to say we might need to be a little patient here, maybe another couple of months. But that this buy signal could very well be the precursor to another substantial upward movement.
Mm-hmm.
And they suggested this movement might really pick up steam once we see the beginning of quantitative easing.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how these big macroeconomic policies can impact the crypto market.
Right.
I mean, quantitative easing at its core, it's when central banks pump more money into the economy.
Oh.
And they often do that by buying up assets.
Okay.
And historically, what happens is this increased liquidity, it can flow into different types of assets,
Sure.
including riskier ones like Bitcoin.
Right.
Investors start looking for higher returns because they're worried about their fiat currencies being devalued.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so this buy signal,
Yeah.
it's a compelling piece of the puzzle.
It is.
But as we all know, Bitcoin doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
The source also pointed to a recent market recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So what were some of the main factors driving that upward swing?
Well, one thing the source highlighted was the connection to some comments from Trump.
Okay.
He hinted at potential brakes on tariffs
Oh, right.
and even called April 2nd Liberation Day.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And that seemed to give a sense of relief to traditional markets that had been under a lot of pressure.
So it seems like a temporary easing of those trade tensions gave the markets a little boost.
Yeah, it seems that way.
But the source was also quick to point out that, these tariffs aren't going away completely.
No.
So those underlying economic uncertainties are still there.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is kind of highlighted by the fact that China invited all these U.S. business leaders to Beijing. And if we connect the dots here, it suggests that China is very aware of the concerns that companies might relocate their manufacturing to the U.S.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
It is. The source even mentioned companies like Hyundai thinking about making that move.
Right, right. It definitely paints a picture of a global economic landscape that's shifting in some pretty big ways.
It does.
And speaking of economic indicators, there's some more data coming out this week, right?
Absolutely.
Data that could really influence things.
The source pointed out that we've got GDP and PCE inflation readings coming out later this week.
Right, right. And for those listening, PCE, that's the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index.
Right. It's a key measure of inflation that the Federal Reserve watches very closely.
Right. So these numbers, they could really sway how the market's feeling.
Oh, absolutely. And on top of that, next week we've got the actual implementation of some of those tariffs.
Oh, that's right.
So that's another big event to watch.
So even with this recent recovery, it sounds like we're still in for a bit of a bumpy ride.
Yeah, there's definitely potential for some big market-moving news.
For sure. And the source made an interesting observation about the performance of altcoins.
Oh, yeah.
What was that?
Well, what's noteworthy is that even though the overall market has recovered, many altcoins are still way down.
Really?
Yeah, the source mentioned drops of 30 to 50% from where they were back in January.
Wow.
So it shows you how deep that downturn really was in the crypto space.
Right.
And it could also be a sign that there are some opportunities emerging, though, of course, with higher risk.
Yeah, of course. So some pretty big price corrections in the altcoin world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Bitcoin inflows and what we're seeing with the ETFs.
Okay.
It seems like there's been a bit of a change in momentum there, too.
Yes, definitely. The fact that Bitcoin has seen inflows for several days in a row, that's a pretty meaningful sign. Now, the source did point out that these inflows aren't as large as the outflows we saw before,
Right.
but they do suggest that there's renewed buying interest.
Oh.
It's like a shift in sentiment, especially around the Bitcoin ETFs, which might have been considered oversold.
Interesting. And you can't talk about ETFs without mentioning the role of, these big institutional players like BlackRock.
No, you can't. They're making some significant moves.
They really are. What are some of the things you're seeing?
Well, it's fascinating to see BlackRock's involvement, not just in the U.S. with their existing Bitcoin ETF, but also their strategic expansion into Europe.
Oh, wow.
They're starting with Germany, and then they have plans for Amsterdam and France.
Wow. Okay.
This really shows a long-term institutional belief in Bitcoin as an asset class,
Mm-hmm.
and it hints at the potential for much wider adoption through these ETFs.
Yeah. But the source did bring up a point about the potential consequences of these large entities like BlackRock accumulating a lot of Bitcoin, especially given its limited supply.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises the question of, what happens if a few large players end up holding a huge chunk of Bitcoin,
Right.
especially considering that it's designed to be decentralized.
Yeah. That's something to think about for the long term, for sure.
It is.
Okay. Well, let's look beyond just the price action in the ETFs for a moment.
Okay.
The source highlighted some other positive developments for Bitcoin and the broader crypto world, developments that really show growing acceptance.
Yeah, some interesting things happening.
What were some of the highlights for you?
Well, the fact that we have several U.S. states, Kentucky, Arizona, Ohio, Oklahoma were mentioned specifically, and they're all actively moving forward with Bitcoin reserve bills.
Oh, wow.
This is a pretty new development in the history of Bitcoin. We haven't seen this level of interest from states before, this interest in making Bitcoin part of their financial systems.
So it's like a very tangible shift in how Bitcoin is being viewed and how it's being integrated.
It really is. And the source also mentioned the appointment of a crypto czar in the White House.
Oh, right. Even though it was short-lived.
Yes, short-lived, but still noteworthy.
Mm.
And then there's the SEC dismissing some cases against crypto projects.
Yeah.
These are all signals of a potentially more constructive regulatory landscape,
Right.
which is a big change from what we've seen in the recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. All these fundamental developments do seem to be pointing towards more mainstream acceptance
They do.
and more integration of crypto into the traditional financial world.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's zoom out a bit and look beyond Bitcoin itself. The source touched on some interesting things happening across the broader crypto ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot going on.
What stood out to you?
Well, one thing that's particularly interesting is BlackRock's move beyond just Bitcoin.
Okay.
They're getting into other areas of the crypto market. Specifically, they launched a money market fund on Solana.
On Solana. Interesting.
Yeah, and they did this in partnership with Securitize. So this highlights the growing adoption of other blockchain technologies like Solana.
Right. And it's interesting because while Ethereum seems to be facing some headwinds right now, there's been talk about the potential for these bundled crypto ETFs.
Yeah, bundle ETFs.
Potentially including ETH, BTC, SOL, XRP.
Right.
The source even mentioned a potential ETF from Trump Media
Oh, interesting.
that was seemingly removed from their social media.
Hmm.
So it's like it hints at a possible future direction for crypto investment products.
It does. The idea of these bundled ETFs offering exposure to a basket of different cryptocurrencies,
Right.
it could make it easier for more people to invest in crypto.
Right.
Kind of like how traditional ETFs work in the stock market.
Right, right. It's fascinating to think about the implications of these kinds of products.
It is.
If they become widely adopted, could it lead to a more diversified crypto market?
Potentially.
Maybe even a less volatile one.
Maybe.
Or, could it create some new systemic risks?
That's a good question. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, definitely. And we also saw some positive news on the stablecoin front, right?
Yes, absolutely. Circle's USDC becoming the first stablecoin approved for use in Japan, that's a big step forward for stablecoins in terms of global regulatory acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
It shows their growing role in the global financial system.
For sure. And finally, the source mentioned a pretty bold legal argument being made for restitution for XRP holders
Oh, right.
due to past actions by the SEC.
Yeah. It's a reflection of the lasting impact of regulatory uncertainty in the crypto space. But, as the source pointed out, it's still very uncertain whether such a large-scale restitution will actually happen.
Okay, so let's bring all of this together.
Okay.
What's the overall market sentiment right now?
Well, the source described the current market as being pretty volatile.
Yeah.
That red-green kind of pattern.
Right, right. It's been all over the place.
It has. And while the stock market has shown some recovery, it doesn't seem to be pushing interest rates down right away,
Mm-hmm.
which could mean that the Federal Reserve might wait a bit longer to cut rates,
Oh, okay.
maybe pushing it back to around June.
Interesting. And it sounds like the source believes that those eventual rate cuts and, the resumption of quantitative easing will be major catalysts for the next big move upwards in the crypto markets.
Yeah, that seems to be the general expectation.
Let's
While
think-
some people are predicting more choppiness in the short term,
Right.
the combination of this rare Bitcoin buy signal, the growing institutional interest, and all these fundamental developments, it does point towards a more positive outlook, at least for the midterm. Okay. So what does all of this mean for you, our listeners?
Well, this rare buy signal for Bitcoin, coupled with recovering markets and the clear trend of increasing adoption that we've seen, it really does suggest that we might be at a pivotal moment in the crypto world. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that volatility is, still a defining characteristic of this space.
Absolutely.
And external economic forces will always have an influence.
Always.
But the underlying fundamentals and the historical patterns associated with this signal, they're definitely worth paying attention to.
I agree. And if we think about the bigger picture, the increasing involvement of these big financial institutions like BlackRock
Right.
and the changes we're seeing in the regulatory landscape, both in the U.S. and globally,
Hmm.
all of this underscores the fact that the cryptocurrency market is maturing.
Yeah.
It's becoming a recognized and potentially integral part of the global financial system.
Absolutely. So keep a close eye on those upcoming economic data releases and any developments with those tariffs, because those are likely to shape where the market goes in the short term.
Right.
And, really take some time to consider how the insights we've explored today align with your own understanding of this space and your own approach to this evolving world of digital assets.
Right.
What parts of this deep dive really resonated with you? What new questions do you have about the growing relationship between traditional finance and the crypto space?
Yeah.
This is just one snapshot in an ongoing and frankly fascinating journey.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.